Imagine hearing singing across black water with no land in sight. Not loud, not theatrical, just a human voice where no human should be. If you were a sailor, exhausted, half-starved, drifting through fog and moonlight, would you trust your eyes? When something pale moved beside the ship, or would you call it what generations before you called it? A siren, a selkie, a thing from the deep. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why the sea created some of the darkest folklore on Earth, and why the truth behind those legends may be just as unsettling as the myths themselves. This is not one single ghost story. It is a late-night descent into the folklore of the sea. The songs sailors swore they heard, the seal women who stepped onto shore, the impossible tentacled shapes rising from black water, and the real-world creatures and conditions that may have given those legends teeth. We're going through the old fear, the worst images ever reported, what these stories cost the people who believed them, and what still does not feel fully explained. Because the sea has always done two things at once. It feeds people, and it teaches them how small they are. That is the perfect breeding ground for folklore, not because sailors were stupid, because they were often alone, sleep-deprived, grieving, superstitious, and staring into the one place on Earth where almost anything can appear. To understand sea folklore, you have to begin with the conditions that created it. Long voyages, bad food, worse weather, isolation, darkness, illness, salt sores, exhaustion. Men staring at the horizon for weeks, with no clear line between reality and imagination. That matters because the first whisper in almost every maritime legend is not a monster. It is misrecognition, a shape seen badly, a sound heard at the wrong hour, a movement in fog that the brain rushes to explain. Take sirens. Today people picture them as beautiful women in the sea, but the oldest versions were stranger than that. In Greek myth, sirens were part woman, part bird, creatures of lure and doom, tied to rocks, wreckage, and irresistible sound. So how did they become fish-tailed women in the water? Hold on to that question. The answer says a lot. Now move north, to cold coasts, grey water, islands where the line between human life and the sea feels thin. A seal resting on a dark rock, watching the camera with large glassy eyes. Fog rolling in behind it, usually tragic. These are not simple monster stories. They are stories about desire and loss, about loving something wild and trying to keep it. Then there is the kraken, the thing sailors described as so vast it could be mistaken for an island until it moved. Tentacles, suckers, ships dragged under, water boiling around a body too large to comprehend. That sounds absurd now, until you remember that giant squid are real. And for most of human history, they were real in exactly the worst way. So here is the first real question. How much of sea folklore came from imagination? And how much came from people seeing something real? This is where the story darkens. Because once you stop treating maritime folklore as childish nonsense, it becomes more disturbing. Take the so-called mermaid sightings reported by sailors. Christopher Columbus himself wrote of seeing mermaid-like figures, but he found them less beautiful than expected. That detail matters. Because what he probably saw were manatees, slow-moving marine mammals, rounded forms. If you had been at sea for months, how much would your mind correct the image? That is one of the most important rules in folklore. People do not simply invent monsters, they collaborate with uncertainty. Whales surfacing like moving cliffs, dead squid washing ashore in impossible shapes. Distance itself becomes deceptive. Now let's go back to selkies, because selkie folklore may be the most emotionally disturbing of the lot. A man finds a seal skin, hides it, and forces the selkie woman to remain on land. She bears children. Then one day she finds the skin and leaves. Some scholars read selkie stories as echoes of abduction or women trapped in lives they never chose. They are about human guilt. Then comes the kraken. For centuries, giant cephalopods belonged to the category of sailors' lies. until carcasses began washing ashore. Then came photographs. Then, finally, live footage. The impossible thing was real, just not in the exact way the stories told it. Or was it? The most terrifying thing about sea folklore is not the creatures themselves. It is what they reveal about the sea as a psychological trap. Not simply monsters, temptation, misreading, approach, the sailor who follows the song, the man who steals the skin. Someone gets closer. A woman's singing that turns out to be wind through rock. A pale body that becomes a corpse. A tentacle mistaken for a serpent. Sirens changed form. Mermaid sightings were likely manatees. Kraken stories sound impossible until you remember giant squid are real. But there is one more layer. Sometimes it preserves real mysteries. There are sounds in the deep we still do not fully explain. So when old sailors described something impossible, were they always wrong? Folklore is a map of where knowledge used to end. If you heard singing over black water with no source in sight, would you lean over the rail to listen more closely? So what is the verdict? As a storyteller, I think maritime folklore is born from three things: real animals, real conditions, and a human mind under pressure. Sirens grew from myths of fatal attraction. Selkies have roots in coastal grief. Krakens owe their life to fragments glimpsed in fragments. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain why certain stories recur in cultures separated by distance. Even when we explain the creature, the atmosphere remains. Somewhere beyond the last visible wave, something is still watching. Which sea legend feels most believable to you? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and stay close. The sea has never stopped making monsters.